The oyster knows before the instrument does. That's what Marcus Dillard's grandfather used to say, sorting shells at the dock table in the late afternoon while the light came low and orange off Morro Bay. He said a healthy oyster was the bay's own report card, that the shell growth told you more about what the water had been doing for the past month than any test a lab could run, because the oyster had been living in it, filtering it, building its body from it. And what it built told the whole story if you knew how to read the record. Marcus was 67 years old. He had been reading the record for 35 years. His grandfather, Raymond Dillard, had established a family's oyster lease in Morro Bay in 1954, selecting a specific section of the embayment after 3 years of careful, unpaid observation, watching where the plankton concentrated at different tide stages, where the current moved clean and consistent, where the water held a particular quality of cold that told you something useful was coming up from depth. Raymond had done this work before he had any assurance the lease would be granted, before he knew whether the economics of a small oyster operation in this bay would support a family, simply because the bay seemed worth understanding before he committed to living beside it. He had kept growth records from the first harvest, shell-weighted yield, spawn timing, mortality rates in different sections. He had kept those records because he believed the oysters told you more about the bay than anything else, and because he had the patience to listen to what they were saying. Those records were in a cardboard box in Marcus's shed, beside his own 35 years of the same careful accounting. 3 families of the Dillard operation, 3 generations of the same small lease, in the same water, watching the same bay. The section of the lease that Marcus called the deep corner had always been his best ground. Not the largest section. The western arm was bigger, closer to the channel, easier to work. But the deep corner produced oysters of a quality that his regulars drove distances to find. They grew faster. They finished cleaner. They tasted of something that Marcus had spent years trying to describe to people and finally stopped trying, because the description never captured what the thing itself communicated the moment you put one on ice and handed it across the counter. He believed it had to do with circulation. The deep corner sat in natural backwater where the bay's bottom contour funneled a particular current through its specific tide stages, concentrating the cold water that came up from depth and sending it across its beds in a consistent, reliable pulse. His grandfather had noticed it first and described it in his earliest records. Water moves through here in the flood and drops temperature fast. Oysters grow heavy. The location holds something the rest of the bay doesn't. Marcus's father had added his own notation a decade later, in a different hand in the same box. Same as Dad said, corner runs cold even in August. Never understood exactly why, but the production never lies. 3 generations of records said the same thing. The deep corner produced. In the spring of Marcus's 63rd year, the deep corner stopped. Not all at once. Not obviously. Not in a way he could point to and name in the first season. The growth rate slipped, 12% below his 5-year average, which was within the range of natural variation. He noted it and moved on, the way you moved on from a slow quarter, keeping an eye, not sounding any alarms. The second season, the growth rate slipped further, 21% below average, and this time accompanied by a change in the oysters themselves, a heaviness of shells that wasn't weight from growth but weight from stress. The way certain animals hold their bodies when they are working against conditions they weren't designed for. He had seen this before, in the hotter years, when the bay ran warm and the oysters redirected energy from growth to thermal regulation. But the water wasn't particularly warm. The instrument on his lease marker showed temperatures within normal range. He checked the instrument. It was working correctly. He checked it again a week later. Still normal. He wrote it in his harvest log with a question mark and tried to think about what else had changed. The regional water utility had been conducting exploratory surveys in the embayment for the better part of 2 years. Marcus had seen their research vessels, the acoustic profiling work, the water column sampling, the core samples taken from the bay floor at various locations. The utility was planning a major desalination plant to supplement freshwater supply for the growing inland area east of the bay. The project would draw seawater through intake pipes positioned in the embayment, treating it to drinking water standards and pumping the fresh water inland. The brine discharge would go back out to sea through a separate outfall some distance from the intakes. The project was large, well-funded, well-documented. The environmental review had been thorough, As far as Marcus could tell from the public record, he had not submitted a formal comment during the review period, which was something he would later consider at length. He had read the documents. He had seen that the proposed intake location was in the section of the embayment near his deep corner. He had thought about the circulation patterns his grandfather had described. He had thought about how the deep corner worked, what made it different from the rest of his lease, why 3 generations of records pointed to that location as the best ground in the bay. And then he had decided he was probably wrong to be concerned, because the utilities marine assessment was comprehensive, because the project team was professional, because the bay was large and an intake pipe was relatively small, and because he was a shellfish farmer, not a hydrologist. He knew the deep corner. He did not know fluid dynamics or intake engineering, or whether his sense that the corner was vulnerable was worth anything at all outside the context of his own experience. He had been wrong before about what was affecting his beds. 3 years ago, he had convinced himself that an anchor drag from a vessel was causing mortality in his southern section, had spent weeks documenting it, had nearly filed a complaint, and had then discovered the problem was a bacterial issue that cleared up with the season. He didn't want to be that person again at a public utility hearing. He did not submit a comment. Later, he would sit with that decision for a long time. The plant came online in the spring of Marcus's 64th year. The intake operated 24 hours a day, drawing a substantial daily volume of seawater through the embayment. The operation was exactly as designed, efficient, regulated, functioning within all permitted parameters. Within 6 weeks of full operation, the deep corner changed. The change was subtle enough that Marcus wasn't certain of it at first. The current pulse that normally passed through the corner at the mid-flood stage felt different, not absent, but altered, less cold, less concentrated, as if something upstream of the corner had shifted, redirecting the cold water flow that had always found its way down to his beds before anything else claimed it. He wrote it down without reaching a conclusion. He needed more data. The summer mortality told him something different was happening. A regional harmful algal bloom moved through the bay that August. Not unusual, not severe, the kind of event that passed through most years and lingered for a week or two before the current dispersed it. His western arm, his northern section, his southern beds all showed the expected brief closure and recovery. The deep corner didn't recover on schedule. The bloom held in that section 3 weeks longer than anywhere else on his lease, and the oysters that had been showing stress weight shells showed elevated mortality during that period that his records had no precedent for across 35 years. He filed a report with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They logged it as part of a broader monitoring dataset on the bloom event, attributing the extended retention in his section to local current variations common in complex embayment geometries during bloom conditions. He read that explanation twice. It wasn't wrong, exactly. Local current variations were real. Complex embayment geometry was real, but it didn't explain why his western arm had cleared in 12 days while the deep corner, which had always moved water more efficiently than any other part of his lease, was still showing active bloom 3 weeks later. He wasn't satisfied with the explanation, because his other sections had recovered normally, because the bloom had cleared from every part of the bay except the deep corner, which was historically the best flushed section he worked. He needed to understand why the deep corner was now behaving differently from everything around it. He drove to his grandfather's cardboard box that evening and spent 3 hours reading. He was looking for something specific, any reference to what the deep corner circulation depended on, what fed it, where the cold water came from before it arrived at his beds. He found it in a log entry from 1961, written after an unusual winter event had sent a clarity to the water that his grandfather had described as rare. The entry read, "Could see the bottom movement clearly today. Cold comes in from depth through the northern basin channel, moves south along the bottom, hits the slope near the corner and deflects upward. That's what drives the pulse. Basin channel to slope, slope to surface. That's the system. Basin channel, northern basin." Marcus sat with that. He pulled up the utilities intake placement documentation on his laptop. The intake structure sat in the northern basin. He did not immediately know what that meant. An intake drew water. It didn't necessarily redirect it. The utilities modeling had addressed flow effects. He was not an engineer. He did not know whether a properly designed intake could disrupt the bottom current moving along a basin channel floor. He thought about it for 2 days before he called anyone. He wrote the question in his harvest log. If the intake is drawing from the basin floor, does it reduce what reaches the corner? Don't know enough to answer. Need someone who does. He found himself going back to his grandfather's 1961 entry more than once, reading the description of the basin channel and the slope and the upward deflection, trying to see whether the intake's position sat inside that system or outside it. He couldn't tell from the documents. He wasn't confident enough in his reading of the engineering drawings to trust his own interpretation. He thought about it for 2 days before he called anyone. He called a marine researcher at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo he'd met at an aquaculture conference, a careful man named Dr. Park who studied nearshore circulation in embayment systems. He described what he'd been seeing: the altered current pulse in the deep corner, the extended bloom retention, the elevated mortality, his grandfather's 1961 description of the cold water system. Dr. Park listened without interrupting. Then he asked a question Marcus hadn't considered. Had the intake changed in elevation or position since the exploratory phase? Marcus said he didn't know. He'd have to look at the documentation. He spent the following afternoon reading every public document the utility had filed. He found what he was looking for in an engineering modification notice filed 8 months after the initial intake design was approved. The intake structure had been lowered 14 feet during final installation to address a seabed stability concern. The modification had been approved administratively without requiring a new environmental review. 14 feet. Marcus's grandfather had described the cold water current moving along the bottom of the northern basin before finding its way south toward his beds. 14 feet was the difference between an intake structure that sat above that current layer and one that sat in it. He called Dr. Park back that afternoon and described the modification. Dr. Park came out the following week with acoustic current profiling equipment, the same technology that mapped water movement in 3 dimensions across a body of water without disturbing it. He ran transects across the northern basin, across the channel between the basin and Marcus's lease, and at multiple points within the deep corner itself. He worked quietly and methodically, and Marcus found himself watching the process the way his grandfather probably watched things, not trying to follow the technical operation, just paying attention to where Dr. Park positioned the instrument, where he repositioned it, what made him pause and take a second reading, what he wrote down without explanation. The data confirmed what Marcus had suspected but hadn't been certain of. The intake structure's lowered position placed it directly in the cold water transport layer that moved along the basin floor. The intake wasn't blocking the current. It was drawing from it. The inflow volume pulled laterally from the bottom transport layer, reducing the volume and velocity of cold water that continued south toward Marcus's lease. The deep corner still received some cold water input, but the pulse was diminished, arriving cooler than the surface but not as cold as it had been, arriving with less velocity, losing its concentrated quality before it reached his beds. The harmful algal bloom had lingered in the deep corner because the cold water pulse that normally refreshed that section had lost the hydraulic energy to flush it out. Marcus read the current profiles in Dr. Park's truck. He thought about his grandfather writing in 1961 about the basin channel and the slope and the way the cold arrived at the corner before it went anywhere else. He thought about his own 35 years of records, the deep corner's consistent production across every season but the last 2. He thought about the engineering modification notice and the 14 feet and the administrative approval that hadn't triggered a new environmental review. He thought about the comment period he hadn't participated in. Dr. Park's formal findings went to the State Water Resources Control Board and to utility directly. The report documented the intake's effect on the cold water transport layer, the correlation with the deep corner's change behavior, and the implications for Marcus's lease, and potentially for other sensitive areas of the embayment that relied on the same basin circulation. The utility commissioned its own review. Their oceanographic consultant confirmed the transport layer disruption, though they characterized its magnitude somewhat differently than Dr. Park had. The disagreement was technical and took several months to resolve through additional monitoring. It resolved in Dr. Park's direction. The utility proposed 2 modifications. First, a partial elevation of the intake structure, not back to its original position, which was no longer structurally feasible, but enough to reduce the draw from the bottom transport layer. Second, a flow patterning device mounted below the intake that would redirect some of the transport current around the structure rather than into it. The modifications took 18 months to design, permit, and install. During that time, Marcus continued working. He moved more production to the western arm, which was less affected and still producing reasonably. He lost 2 accounts whose supply relationships depended on the deep corner and gained a new one through a restaurant that had heard about his situation. He didn't know how to feel about the support. It was genuine. It just wasn't the same as the corner running right. Marcus watched it happen from his lease, recording what he saw each season the way his grandfather had recorded what he saw, the way his father had, the way he had been doing since he was 32 years old, and the cardboard box had been handed to him along with the lease itself. The first full season after the modifications, the pulse in the deep corner returned to something close to what his records showed it had been. Not identical. The intake was still there, still operating, and the system it had entered was not the same system it had found. But the cold came through again at the flood stage, and it came with something closer to its original velocity, and the oysters that had been showing stress weight shells began showing growth weight shells instead. His harvest numbers for the deep corner that year were the best in 4 seasons. Not exceptional, not the numbers from his peak years, but trending in the right direction, in the pattern that 3 generations of records said the deep corner was capable of reaching when the water was doing what was supposed to do. Marcus's grandfather had spent 3 years watching this bay before he committed to it. He had recorded what he saw because he believed the records were the memory of the operation, that without them, every generation would have to relearn what the previous one had already understood. The cardboard box in the shed held 60 years of that memory. Marcus's 35 volumes sat beside it. 60 years of the same operation, the same lease, the same careful attention to what the bay was doing. 3 different hands writing in 3 different notebooks, but the same categories, the same questions, the same patience with the answers. The cardboard box had been handed to Marcus's father when Raymond stepped back, and then to Marcus when his father could no longer work the lease. Each time, the records came with it. The records were not separate from the lease. They were the lease. He opened his current harvest log on the morning. The first strong cold pulse came through after the intake modifications. He sat at the lease table with the cardboard box open beside him and his own current volume open in front of him, the 2 sets of records side by side the way they had been for 35 years. He wrote the date, the water temperature at the lease marker, the current velocity reading from his own instrument, and the growth rate at last inspection. Then he wrote something he didn't usually include in the harvest log, a line his grandfather might have written, the kind of notation that sat outside the numbers but explained something the numbers alone couldn't carry. Pulses back in the corner, not full strength, getting there. The bay remembers how it's supposed to work, even when people interrupt it for a while. He closed the log. He walked to the corner of his lease and stood in the cold morning air, looking at the water. The tide was running the way his grandfather had described it in 1961. The cold came from depth, moved south along the basin floor, deflected up the slope, and arrived at the deep corner before it went anywhere else. The oysters were already eating. They had been the first to know something was wrong. They would be the first to know it was getting better. That was how it had always worked. That was the record. If you knew how to read it. If you knew that reading it meant 60 years of patience, 3 generations of the same question asked of the same water, and the discipline to write down the answer every time whether or not you could see yet why it mattered.